June 13th, 1944. 0900 hours. Villers-Bocage, France. The distinctive thunder of an 88mm cannon echoed through the narrow Norman street. Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann's Tiger tank rolled forward like an iron leviathan, its 56 tons crushing the cobblestones beneath its tracks. Behind him lay a scene of absolute devastation. 20 British vehicles destroyed in 15 minutes. Cromwell tanks, their thin armor no match for German engineering superiority. Stuart light tanks torn apart like tin cans, half-tracks burning. The Desert Rats, Britain's most famous armored division, had been caught completely unprepared. Wittmann radioed his company, satisfaction evident in his voice. The English have paper armor. Their new tanks are jokes. Fast, perhaps, but useless in a real fight. One Tiger is worth 10 of their Cromwells. His crew nodded in agreement. They had just witnessed the proof. German propaganda would make much of this morning's work. The invincible Wehrmacht crushing British tanks with contemptuous ease. The Tiger, a technological marvel that no Allied tank could match. The Cromwell, a pathetic attempt to build something modern, failing spectacularly against true German steel. What Wittmann didn't know, what none of the German tank commanders could have imagined, was that they had just awakened something they couldn't understand. The Cromwell wasn't designed to trade blows with Tigers at close range in narrow streets. It was built for something the Germans had forgotten how to do: movement, speed, exploitation. The very things that had won them France in 1940 were about to destroy them in 1944. The British were learning, and when they finally understood how to use their fastest tank, the hunters would become the hunted. In early 1941, British tank design was in crisis. The Churchill infantry tank, just entering production, was a fortress on tracks. 42 tons of armor moving at 15 miles per hour. Excellent protection. Pathetic speed. Perfect for the trench warfare mentality that still dominated British military thinking. But the Western Desert was teaching brutal lessons about mobility. Rommel's Afrika Korps didn't fight static battles. They moved, struck, vanished. British tanks that couldn't keep pace simply died. The War Office, reviewing combat reports from North Africa, issued new specifications in March 1941. They wanted speed and reliability over heavy armor. 24 tons maximum weight. 24 miles per hour minimum speed. A 75mm gun capable of firing both armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds. Mechanical reliability that would let tanks operate for days without breaking down. The challenge was the engine. British tank engines were universally terrible. The Liberty engine used in Crusader tanks produced 350 horsepower when it worked, which wasn't often. The Nuffield engines weren't much better. German tanks, for all their other faults, had reliable power plants. The British needed something revolutionary. Enter Rolls-Royce. The company famous for luxury automobiles had spent the 1930s perfecting something entirely different. The Merlin, a 27-liter V12 engine that powered Spitfires and Hurricanes. By 1941, Merlins were producing over 1,000 horsepower for aircraft. Someone at Rolls-Royce asked a simple question: what if we put one in a tank? The official response was skeptical. Tank engines didn't need to be sophisticated. They just needed to be reliable and cheap. The Merlin was neither. It was complex, expensive, designed for flight. But William Robotham, an engineer at Rolls-Royce, saw potential. The Merlin's fundamental design was sound. Remove the supercharger needed for high-altitude flight. Replace some expensive aircraft-grade components with heavier steel parts suitable for ground use. Modify the compression ratio to run on ordinary petrol instead of high-octane aviation fuel. The result would be simpler, more durable, and still incredibly powerful. On April 6, 1941, the first modified Merlin was fitted into a Crusader tank at Aldershot. The test crew approached it nervously. This experimental engine, built from salvaged aircraft parts, was about to face the Army's standard speed trial. What happened next entered British tank development legend. The driver pressed the accelerator. The Crusader, normally capable of 24 miles per hour, leapt forward like a scalded cat. 30 miles per hour. 40. The officers timing the run with stopwatches were so surprised they forgot to signal each other. 50 miles per hour. The driver, overwhelmed by the speed, failed to take a corner. The tank decapitated a telegraph pole and spread wire across half an acre. When they finally got the driver out, shaking but unhurt, someone checked the rev counter. The engine had exceeded 50 miles per hour. In a tank. The test officers immediately ordered a second run to confirm. Same result. The modified Merlin, now christened the Meteor, produced 600 horsepower, nearly twice the power of any existing British tank engine, in the same size package. The Ministry of Supply placed orders immediately. 1,000 Meteor engines to start. A new tank specification, the A27M, was created specifically to use this revolutionary power plant. That tank would be called the Cromwell. The Cromwell that emerged in January 1943 was unlike anything Britain had built before. Low-slung compared to the Churchill. Wide-tracked for cross-country mobility. Armed with a 75mm gun that could use American ammunition, simplifying supply in the European theater. And powered by that glorious Meteor engine. The statistics told the story. 28 tons combat weight. 64mm frontal armor. Not thick, by Tiger standards, but respectable. Maximum speed of 40 miles per hour on roads. 32 miles per hour cross-country. Operational range of 170 miles. A 5-man crew commander, gunner, loader, driver, and hull machine gunner. All crammed into a hull 6.3 meters long and just under 3 meters wide. But the real magic was in the engineering. The Meteor engine delivered not just power, but torque. 1,450 foot-pounds at 2,400 revolutions per minute. That massive torque meant acceleration. Real acceleration. The kind that let a 28-ton tank move like a sports car. The Merritt-Brown gearbox, a sophisticated 5-speed transmission with a controlled differential, made the power usable. Drivers could change direction by braking one track while maintaining power to the other. Turning circles tightened dramatically. Maneuvering became instinctive rather than laborious. The suspension was equally important. An improved Christie system with 5 large road wheels per side, each independently sprung. The Cromwell could maintain high speeds over rough terrain without shaking its crew to pieces or breaking its tracks. German tanks using torsion bar suspension had better weight distribution. But Christie suspension had one massive advantage. It was simple, reliable, easy to maintain in field conditions. British crews training on Cromwells in late 1943 had mixed reactions. Tankers transferring from Shermans found the Cromwell cramped. The turret was smaller. Less room to move. The armor was thinner than they liked. That 75mm gun, while effective against most German tanks, couldn't penetrate a Panther frontally. Tigers were essentially immune except at close range from the side or rear. But the speed. That changed everything. Lieutenant John Gorman of the 2nd Armored Irish Guards recorded his first Cromwell drive in a letter home. I put my foot down, and the tank simply flew. We were doing 35 miles per hour across a field. In a tank. I've never felt anything like it. The acceleration is extraordinary. You think about going faster, and you're already moving. The 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, returned from Italy to England in November 1943. Montgomery wanted them for the invasion of Europe. More specifically, he wanted them as his breakthrough division. fast, aggressive, experienced. To do that job, they needed the fastest tanks Britain could provide. The 7th Armored Division became the only British armored division equipped entirely with Cromwells as their main battle tank. 3 Cromwells and 1 Sherman Firefly per troop. The Firefly, with its 17-pounder gun, could kill Tigers and Panthers. The Cromwells provided mobility and firepower against everything else. It seemed like a solid mix, speed and punch. The Desert Rats landed on Gold Beach on June 7, 1944. D-Day, +1. Their combat debut was scheduled for Operation Perch, an attempt to encircle Caen. The plan assumed open ground where Cromwells could use their speed. What they got instead was Bocage, Norman hedgerow country, narrow lanes, thick vegetation, perfect terrain for ambush, terrible terrain for fast tanks. On June 13th, the vanguard of the 7th Armored Division rolled into Villers-Bocage. The town appeared undefended. British commanders, eager to exploit what seemed like an open flank, pushed forward rapidly. Too rapidly. Reconnaissance was cursory at best. Nobody knew that Wittmann's Tiger Company was resting in the woods just outside town. The ambush was devastating. Wittmann's lone Tiger destroyed the rearmost British tanks on Point 213 before any crew could react. Then he drove into Villers-Bocage itself. British tank crews were dismounted, making tea. Performing routine maintenance, they never had a chance. The Tiger's 88mm gun had an effective range of 3,000 meters. In the confines of a Norman town, engagements happened at 50 meters, point-blank range where armor thickness meant nothing. German propaganda made the most of Villers-Bocage. 1 heroic Tiger commander, dozens of British tanks destroyed, the mighty Desert Rats humiliated. The Cromwell, they crowed, was proof that British tank design remained hopelessly inferior. Fast, perhaps, but fragile. Paper armor on a racing chassis. What the propaganda missed was equally important. British forces recovered. By afternoon, they had organized a defense that stopped subsequent German attacks cold. Sherman Fireflies knocked out several Tigers. 6-pounder anti-tank guns disabled Wittmann's tank. The Germans eventually took Villers-Bocage, but it cost them dearly. And the British learned something crucial from the disaster. The Cromwell wasn't a brawler. Trying to fight Tigers in close terrain was suicide. But there was another way to use this tank. The German way. The Blitzkrieg way. Speed, shock, exploitation. Don't fight where the enemy is strong. Move around them. Hit supply lines. Exploit gaps. Keep moving so fast the enemy can't respond. Brigadier William Hind, commanding the 22nd Armored Brigade, began developing new tactics. Use the Cromwell's speed for reconnaissance in force. Find gaps in German lines. Punch through before they could react. Let infantry and heavier tanks deal with strong points. The Cromwells would bypass, penetrate, exploit. Move so fast that German tank destroyers couldn't get into position. So fast that Tigers couldn't catch them. These tactics needed the right opportunity. Bocage country wasn't it. Those thick hedgerows nullified speed advantages, but eventually the front would open up. When it did, the Cromwells would be ready. Operation Goodwood in mid-July demonstrated the challenge. British armor attacking south of Caen ran into the most concentrated German defenses in Normandy. Panthers and Tigers positioned in depth, anti-tank guns covering every approach. The 7th Armored Division lost tanks steadily. Cromwell's particularly struggled. Their armor couldn't withstand frontal hits from German guns. Their own 75mm couldn't penetrate German heavy tanks except from the flank. But Goodwood accomplished something important. It held German attention. Panzer divisions that might have reinforced the western sector stayed around Caen, fighting British and Canadian forces, which meant when the Americans launched Operation Cobra on July 25th, they faced weaker opposition. Cobra broke the German line. By July 30th, American forces were pouring through the gap. German commanders frantically tried to reposition. They moved the 2nd Panzer Division west to counter the American breakthrough, which left a weak spot in the center, between the British right flank and the American left. A boundary gap covered by tired infantry and not much else. Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, commanding 2nd British Army, saw the opportunity. He ordered 8 corps to attack, immediately. No time for elaborate preparation. Hit the weak point before the Germans could reinforce. The operation was called Bluecoat. The 11th Armored Division would lead État Corps attack. Unlike the 7th Armored Division, the 11th was equipped primarily with Shermans. But their reconnaissance regiment, the 15th 19th Hussars, had Cromwells. And Major General Pip Roberts, commanding the 11th, understood what those fast tanks could do. On July 30th, the 11th Armored Division attacked. German resistance was confused. The weak infantry divisions holding the line weren't expecting a major assault. The Bocage was terrible terrain, but British forces pushed through. Slowly at first. But on July 31st, everything changed. The household cavalry, scouting ahead, found something extraordinary. A bridge over the Soulevre River, 5 miles behind German lines, completely undefended. The bridge, quickly nicknamed Dickey's Bridge after the lieutenant who discovered it, represented a catastrophic German command failure. The inter-army boundary between 7th Army and Panzer Group West ran through a forest. Neither side had bothered to guard the single road through it. Roberts understood immediately what this meant. A gap straight through German defenses. He ordered 29th Armored Brigade forward, maximum speed, infantry mounted on tanks. Secure that bridge before the Germans realized what was happening. The Cromwells of the Reconnaissance Regiment led the way. This was the moment they had been built for. The narrow roads meant single file. But once across the bridge, open country beckoned. The Cromwells accelerated. 35 miles per hour on rough roads. German defenders saw British tanks behind their lines and panicked. Units that might have formed strong points retreated instead, afraid of being cut off, encircled. The speed was intoxicating. British tank commanders discovered what German panzer commanders had known in 1940. Fast armored forces create chaos out of proportion to their numbers. Defenders can't form coherent lines. They don't know where attacks are coming from. Units become isolated. Command and control collapses. By August 2nd, elements of the 11th Armored Division had advanced 15 miles in 2 days. They were approaching Vire, a major road junction. German commanders threw together a hasty defense. The 9th SS Panzer Division, pulled from the eastern sector, finally arrived to plug the gap. But it was too late to restore the line. The British had broken through. German forces in Normandy were being squeezed from both sides. The Cromwells had proven something. In the right circumstances, speed trumped armor. A fast tank that avoided enemy strength was more valuable than a heavy tank that tried to fight everywhere. German Tigers and Panthers were formidable in defensive positions, but they couldn't stop an exploitation they couldn't catch. Sergeant Bill Shaw of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, 11th Armored Division, recorded the breakthrough in his diary. We drove through German positions so fast they barely shot at us. By the time their anti-tank guns turned around, we were past them, kept moving, didn't stop. That Meteor engine just kept pulling, hour after hour. We covered ground that would have taken infantry a week. The Germans couldn't believe how far we'd penetrated. Neither could we. The German response to Bluecoat revealed their problem. They had magnificent tanks, Tigers, with 88mm guns and armor that shrugged off most Allied hits. Panthers with sloped armor and excellent guns. But they were designed for a different kind of war. Defensive, methodical. The blitzkrieg that had conquered France was a memory. Now they fought to hold ground, not to maneuver. Cromwells, by contrast, were pure exploitation vehicles. Decent armor, decent gun, extraordinary mobility. Used correctly, they didn't need to fight German heavy tanks. They went around them, found supply depots, wrecked communications, created chaos. Major Hans von Luck, commanding a battalion in 21st Panzer Division, encountered British Cromwells during the Normandy breakout. His report to division headquarters captured German frustration. The English cruiser tanks are extraordinarily fast. We position our Panthers to block a road. Before we can engage, they've found another route. We turn to pursue. They're gone. By the time we reach what we think is their position, they've moved again. Fighting them is like fighting ghosts. They appear, strike, vanish. Our heavy tanks cannot match this mobility. The killing blow came not from British forces, but from a combination. Americans broke out from the west. British and Canadians pushed from the north and east. Germans tried to retreat, but they were too slow. Allied air power dominated the skies. Movement during daylight invited instant destruction. Fast Allied tanks covered ground quickly. German heavy tanks, fuel-starved and mechanically unreliable, couldn't escape. The Falaise Pocket in mid-August became a killing ground. Tens of thousands of German soldiers trapped, hundreds of tanks destroyed or abandoned. Among the captured equipment were dozens of Tigers and Panthers, immobilized by lack of fuel, abandoned because they broke down, destroyed by Allied fighter bombers that caught them in the open. British tank crews examined the German vehicles with interest. The Tigers were impressive, enormous, brilliantly engineered. But the complexity was stunning. The interleaved road wheels, designed to distribute weight, collected mud that froze solid in winter. Removing an inner wheel required removing 5 outer wheels. A simple track repair became an all-day job. The Maybach engines were powerful but temperamental. Fine tolerances meant any contamination caused problems. The Panthers were better, excellent guns, good armor, but still temperamental. And they drank fuel. A Panther consumed 2 gallons per mile. Combat operations meant even worse fuel economy. Germany simply couldn't supply that much petrol. Cromwell's, by comparison, were simple. The Meteor engine was reliable. Spare parts were available. Track repairs were straightforward. The Christie suspension was easy to maintain. Fuel consumption was reasonable. Not great, but manageable. A Cromwell could operate for days without specialized maintenance. After the Falaise Gap closed, the race across France began. The Allies needed to reach the Seine before Germans could establish a new defensive line. The 11th Armored Division, spearheading British Second Army's advance, covered extraordinary distances, 70 miles in a day, then 60 more the next day. Cromwell's led the advance. Behind them came Shermans, supply trucks, infantry. But the Cromwells found the routes, identified German positions, kept moving. German forces retreating from Normandy discovered that British tanks were suddenly everywhere. Major Otto Henning, commanding a Kampfgruppe from 9th SS Panzer, recorded his unit's attempted withdrawal in a post-war interrogation. We left Falaise at night, moved east toward the Seine. By dawn, we were still short of the river. Then British tanks appeared ahead of us. Different British tanks appeared on our flank. We thought we had escaped the encirclement. Instead, we had British tanks in front, behind, both flanks. We surrendered. Our Panthers were out of fuel anyway. The Seine crossing in late August demonstrated Allied dominance. German engineers destroyed bridges, but Allied forces simply built new ones. Engineers threw pontoon bridges across the river in hours. Cromwells crossed, barely pausing, and continued east. Destination Paris, then Belgium, then Holland, then Germany itself. The drive through France revolutionized British armored tactics. Montgomery, never quick to praise, sent a memo to all armored divisions in early September. The exploitation of enemy weakness through rapid movement has proven decisive. Our cruiser tanks, properly employed, can achieve results far beyond their nominal combat power. Speed creates opportunities. Opportunities win battles. The 7th Armored Division, rehabilitated after Villers-Bocage, advanced through Belgium at speeds that astounded everyone. On September 2nd, they covered over 50 miles. On September 3rd, they entered Brussels. Civilians lined the streets cheering. British tankers, exhausted but elated, threw cigarettes and chocolate to the crowds. The Cromwells kept moving. Destination Antwerp. On September 4th, elements of the 7th Armored Division entered Antwerp. The Germans had prepared extensive demolitions, bridges, port facilities, all wired for destruction. But British forces arrived so quickly, the demolition teams hadn't finished. Lieutenant John Gorman, commanding a Cromwell troop, captured an intact bridge over the Albert Canal. He simply drove across at full speed. German engineers, surprised by tanks appearing hours earlier than expected, fled before they could trigger explosives. The speed had achieved what firepower couldn't. Antwerp's port facilities, desperately needed to supply Allied armies, were captured largely intact. German commanders couldn't believe how quickly British forces had moved. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, raged at his staff. The English have driven from the Seine to Antwerp in 5 days. 5 days. Our Panzers took 8 days to reach Dunkirk in 1940. With no opposition, the English are moving faster through contested terrain than we moved through a collapsing enemy. The Cromwell's finest hour came during the fighting around the German border in autumn 1944. Market Garden, the airborne operation to seize bridges into Germany, grabbed headlines. But parallel operations by British armored divisions kept German forces off balance, unable to concentrate against any single threat. The Guards Armored Division spearheaded the drive up Highway 69 toward Arnhem. But the 11th Armored Division, operating on the right flank, played an equally crucial role. Their job was to protect the corridor, keep German forces from cutting the highway, find alternative routes if the main road became blocked. Cromwells of the 15th 19th Hussars ranged far ahead of the main force, scouting, probing, looking for German positions, finding ways around strong points. The speed let them take enormous risks. If they encountered serious opposition, they simply withdrew, tried a different route. German defenders found themselves bypassed repeatedly, forced to retreat or risk encirclement. This was mobile warfare as the Germans had once practiced it. But now the boot was on the other foot. Allied tanks had the speed. Allied forces had the fuel. German defenders were static, predictable, increasingly desperate. Oberst Friedrich von der Heydte, commanding a parachute regiment in Holland, wrote in his post-war memoirs about fighting British tanks in September 1944. "I had excellent soldiers, well-trained, determined, adequate anti-tank guns, but the English gave us no time to prepare positions properly. Their reconnaissance tanks appeared everywhere. We would identify an English column moving west, prepare to ambush it. Then different English tanks appeared from the north. We turned to face them. More appeared from the south. They were so fast we couldn't track their movements. By the time we understood their positions, they had moved again." The Meteor engine's reliability became crucial during these operations. German tanks, even when fueled, broke down regularly. Panthers needed major overhauls every 1,500 kilometers. Tigers required constant maintenance. Cromwells could operate for much longer between services. The Meteor, descended from aircraft engines built to fly for hours at high power, proved remarkably durable under sustained use. Sergeant Thomas Wright, a Cromwell driver with the 1st Royal Tank Regiment, described operating in Holland. "We drove that tank hard for 3 weeks. Every day. Sometimes all night. Rough roads, cross-country, pushing the engine constantly. It never missed a beat. The maintenance crews changed oil, checked tracks, basic servicing. But the engine kept running. I've heard horror stories about German tanks breaking down constantly. Our Cromwells just worked. By late autumn 1944, the campaign had bogged down. German resistance stiffened along the border. Allied supply lines, stretched from Normandy beaches, couldn't deliver enough fuel and ammunition for continuous operations. The weather deteriorated. Rain, mud, conditions that favored defenders. But the Cromwell had proven its worth. British commanders understood now what they had. Not a heavy tank that could trade blows with Tigers, but an exploitation vehicle that could turn breakthroughs into routes. The tank that Germans had mocked as paper armor had run circles around their heaviest Panzers. Literally. The statistics told the story. From the Normandy breakout in August through December 1944, the 7th Armored Division advanced over 800 miles. The 11th Armored Division covered similar distances. German armored divisions, by contrast, retreated fighting, covering perhaps 400 miles in the same period. The difference was speed. Cromwells moved 70 miles on a good day. German heavy tanks managed 30 if they were lucky. More importantly, Cromwells were there, operational, running. German tank strength declined steadily through autumn 1944, not primarily from battle losses, though those were significant, but from breakdowns, lack of spare parts, fuel shortages. A Panther battalion might start an operation with 40 tanks. 2 weeks later, 25 were still running. The rest were in workshops, or abandoned by roadside, waiting for spare parts that never came. British armored divisions maintained operational strength. Cromwells broke down too, but less often, and they were easier to fix. If a Cromwell needed a new engine, fitters could swap one in overnight. Meteor engines were manufactured in multiple factories. Spare parts flowed steadily from Britain. The logistics worked. German tankers, skilled and experienced, found themselves increasingly frustrated. Their training emphasized technical excellence, mechanical understanding, precision gunnery, all valuable qualities. But tactics had evolved beyond those fundamentals. Modern armored warfare rewarded speed, endurance, and operational tempo, not individual combat prowess. Hauptmann Klaus Barenfänger, commanding a Tiger company in the autumn of 1944, expressed this frustration in letters home. "Our Tigers are magnificent machines. In a straight fight, one Tiger can defeat any Allied tank, 3 Allied tanks, 5. We are technically superior in every measurable way, but we never get straight fights anymore. The English appear, force us to react, then disappear. By the time we lumber into position, they are attacking somewhere else. We have the finest tanks in the world, but we are always too slow, too late. It is maddening." The winter of 1944 to 45 brought new challenges. The Battle of the Bulge in December saw German forces launch one last desperate offensive, but the attack went through the American sector. British forces, positioned to the north, prepared to counterattack if needed. Cromwell units stood ready. Fast reaction forces that could move to threatened sectors rapidly. When the German offensive stalled, British forces attacked the northern shoulder. Cromwells led reconnaissance in force, probing German positions, finding weak points. The tactics were now standard. Use speed to find gaps. Exploit those gaps before the enemy could react. Keep moving. Never let the Germans stabilize their front. By January 1945, Allied armies were preparing for the final push into Germany. The Cromwell had evolved from a tank that Germans mocked to one they feared, not because of its armor or gun, but because of what it represented. The Allies had mastered mobile warfare, the kind of warfare Germany had pioneered, and now they were using it to crush the Reich. The irony was exquisite. In 1940, German Panzer divisions had raced through France, fast, aggressive, exploiting Allied weaknesses. French heavy tanks like the Char B had excellent armor and guns, but they were slow, cumbersome. German Panzers simply drove around them, cut supply lines, created chaos. The French couldn't respond fast enough. In 1944, the script had flipped. German Tigers and Panthers had excellent armor and guns, but they were slow, fuel-starved, mechanically unreliable. Allied tanks, particularly Cromwell's, simply drove around them, cut supply lines, created chaos. The Germans couldn't respond fast enough. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 demonstrated how completely the situation had reversed. British forces crossed under massive artillery bombardment. German defenders fought desperately. But once across, British armor exploited ruthlessly. Cromwell's raced into German rear areas, seizing crossroads, cutting communications, moving faster than German commanders could process information. Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, commanding XX Corps, used Cromwell-equipped units as his exploitation force. After infantry and heavy tanks secured crossings, the Cromwells poured through. Their mission was simple: go as fast and as far as possible. Bypass resistance. Keep moving until you run out of fuel or meet impassable obstacles. The tactic worked brilliantly. German forces, attempting to establish defensive lines, found British tanks already behind them. Units retreating to prepared positions discovered Cromwell's occupying those positions. Surrender rates skyrocketed, not from combat losses, from psychological shock. German defenders simply couldn't cope with the speed of Allied movements. Feldwebel Ernst Müller, captured in April 1945, told his interrogators about facing British tanks near Hamburg. We received orders to retreat to the next town, establish defensive positions. We marched through the night, arrived at dawn. English tanks were already there, waiting for us. I do not understand how they moved so fast. We had a head start. They must have driven all night, through enemy territory. Without knowing the roads, it seemed impossible. We had no choice but to surrender. The speed campaign reached its climax in the drive to Hamburg and beyond. British armored divisions covered vast distances, 70 miles, 80 miles, sometimes more in a single day. German resistance collapsed, not from being defeated in battle, from being overwhelmed by operational tempo. They couldn't respond, couldn't reposition, couldn't fight effectively when they never knew where British forces would appear next. On May 3, 1945, lead elements of the 7th Armored Division entered Hamburg. The city surrendered without serious fighting. Local German commanders, seeing British tanks suddenly appear in multiple locations, recognized continued resistance was futile. The speed had broken German will to fight as surely as firepower could have. The war in Europe ended 5 days later. British forces controlled northwest Germany. Cromwells sat in German cities. The tanks that German propaganda had ridiculed as paper armor had driven from Normandy to the Baltic. 800 miles, through some of the most heavily defended territory in the world. The final accounting revealed the Cromwell's true achievement. Not in kill ratios, not in armor thickness, but in operational impact. British armored divisions equipped with Cromwells covered more ground, faster than any other Allied units. They created the conditions for victory, breakthrough, exploitation, pursuit, the fundamental elements of mobile warfare. German officers, interviewed after the war, consistently cited Allied mobility as decisive. Major General Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, who had served on multiple fronts, wrote in his memoirs, "The Allies won through logistical superiority and operational tempo. Their tanks were not individually superior to ours. Many were inferior, but they were always there, always moving, always threatening. We could win tactical battles, But we lost the operational war. Their mobility overwhelmed our defensive skills. The Cromwell story validated a principle that military theorists had understood, but rarely applied. In mobile warfare, speed is armor. A fast tank that avoids enemy fire is more survivable than a slow tank that withstands enemy fire. A tank that can choose when and where to fight has an advantage no amount of armor can match. The Cromwell proved this principle across 800 miles of battlefield. British tank crews, initially skeptical of their mounts, became believers. They had started the campaign worried about thin armor. They ended it understanding that not being hit was better than withstanding hits. The Meteor engine's reliability meant they could count on their tanks when needed. The speed meant they could dictate engagements, choose advantageous positions, retreat if necessary, without being caught. Trooper James Henderson, a Cromwell gunner with the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, summed up the crew perspective in a letter home written in May 1945. "We made it. Germany to the Baltic Sea. Our Cromwell never let us down. The engine ran perfectly for months. We outran German tanks, got out of trouble when we needed to. The Germans called us paper armor. Maybe. But we're alive, and they're dead. I'll take fast over thick any day." The technical lessons were equally important. The Meteor engine, adapted from aircraft use, proved that high-performance automotive engineering could work in tanks. Previous tank engines had been marinized truck engines, or purpose-built low-performance units. The Meteor showed that sophisticated engineering, properly adapted, delivered reliability along with power. Post-war British tank design would build on this lesson. The Centurion tank, developed in late 1944 and deployed too late to see combat, used a Meteor engine. So did the Comet, the Cromwell's improved successor. The Meteor remained in production until 1964, 20 years of service. The engine that powered Spitfires to victory in the Battle of Britain also powered British tanks through the Cold War. The operational lessons shaped NATO doctrine for decades. Fast, mobile armored forces designed to exploit enemy weaknesses, not to hold ground, not to slug it out in attritional battles, but to penetrate, disrupt, destroy. The Cromwell proved these tactics worked against a skilled, experienced enemy under difficult conditions. German veterans, reflecting on their defeat, often returned to the theme of mobility. Oberst Hans von Luck, who had fought against Cromwell's in Normandy and again in Germany, wrote extensively about the experience. In 1940, we won because we understood that speed and surprise matter more than raw combat power. Our Panzer divisions were smaller than French armored formations, less well-equipped in many ways, but we moved faster, struck where they didn't expect. By 1944, the British had learned this lesson. They used it against us. Their Cromwell tanks, which we initially dismissed, became the instrument of our defeat, not through superior firepower, but through superior operational thinking. The post-war fate of captured German tanks illustrated the point. Tigers and Panthers, once feared as invincible, became museum pieces. Technical curiosities, impressive to look at, but too complex, too expensive, too fuel-hungry for practical military use. The Cromwell, by contrast, soldiered on. The British Army used them until 1955. Other nations acquired them. Portugal used Cromwells into the 1960s. The tank that Germans had mocked outlasted every German tank design by decades. The story of the Cromwell versus German Panzers wasn't primarily about individual tank duels. Though those happened, it was about operational philosophy. The Germans had built tanks for a defensive war they were forced to fight. Heavy, powerful, slow. The British eventually built tanks for the offensive war they needed to wage. Fast, reliable, maneuverable. When Whitman destroyed those Cromwells at Villers-Bocage in June 1944, he thought he had proven German superiority. One Tiger defeating multiple British tanks. But he had missed the larger point. The Cromwells weren't there to fight Tigers in close terrain. They were there to exploit openings, create chaos, move faster than German forces could respond. By August, British commanders understood this. By September, they were implementing it. By May 1945, they had driven from Normandy to the Baltic, using tactics that prioritized speed over firepower. The Cromwell, for all its limitations, was the perfect vehicle for that mission. The mathematics of the campaign proved the point. British Second Army, equipped primarily with Shermans and Cromwells, advanced 800 miles in 9 months. That's over 80 miles per month. In contested terrain, against a skilled enemy. The fastest advance by any army in history to that point. Faster than the German advance through France in 1940. Faster than the Soviet advances in 1944. Faster than anything American forces achieved. The secret wasn't better tanks in traditional terms, it was tanks used better, understanding that in mobile warfare, operational tempo matters more than tactical superiority. A tank that's 20 miles ahead of the front line creates more havoc than a tank that's invincible but static. The Cromwell excelled at being 20 miles ahead. German Panzers excelled at being invincible while static. History recorded which approach worked. In the final analysis, the Cromwell's greatest achievement was forcing a conceptual revolution. British tankers started the war thinking about armor thickness and gun caliber, individual tank capabilities. They ended the war thinking about operational mobility and strategic tempo. System capabilities. The Cromwell, with its Spitfire-derived engine and remarkable speed, taught that lesson over 800 miles of European battlefield. The Germans had called it paper armor, a racing chassis with pretensions of combat effectiveness. But the Cromwell had the last word. It raced past German strong points, outran German Panzers, exploited gaps German commanders couldn't plug, and delivered British forces to Hamburg while German heavy tanks sat abandoned by roadsides, out of fuel and out of time. Speed had proven more valuable than armor, reliability more important than individual power, operational tempo more decisive than tactical excellence. The Cromwell taught these lessons to a generation of tankers. The fast tank, properly employed, was the war winner, not because it could survive German fire, but because it never gave the Germans a chance to fire at all. The legacy continued for decades. NATO doctrine emphasized mobile warfare, fast armored formations, exploitation of enemy weaknesses, all principles the Cromwell had validated in combat. Modern main battle tanks, for all their sophistication, still prioritize mobility alongside firepower and protection. The balance the Cromwell pioneered remains fundamental to tank design. And somewhere, in the histories of the Second World War, Whitman's voice echoes, calling the Cromwell paper armor, mocking British engineering, confident in German superiority. He never lived to see how wrong he was. Killed in August 1944 by a Sherman Firefly that caught his Tiger by surprise. Speed and surprise. The very tactics the Cromwell embodied. The Desert Rats, humiliated at Villers-Bocage in June, entered Hamburg in May. Vindicated. Their Cromwells, far from being jokes, had become symbols of British armored might. Fast. Reliable. Deadly when used correctly. The tank that proved you don't need the thickest armor if you're too fast to catch. You don't need the biggest gun if you're hitting the enemy from behind. And you don't need to be invincible if you're everywhere at once. The Cromwell outran German Panzers, then it destroyed them from behind. Paper armor, the Germans had said. But paper armor moving at 40 miles per hour proved more effective than steel plate crawling at 15. That was the lesson of 1944. Speed kills, not through direct combat, but through operational dominance. The Cromwell taught that lesson from Normandy to the Baltic. 800 miles of proof that in modern war, the fastest tank often wins.